So, we've talked about epistemology, and we've discussed some of the peculiarities of how science knows what it knows. I want to turn our attention now to just how much we know. How much new knowledge has science generated? It turns out that this is a really important question with broad and practical implications for knowledge storage, communication, and computational logistics. It also turns out to be an incredibly difficult question to answer, depending critically on the assumptions you make, the kinds of information storage you consider, and the ways you try to account for duplicate information. One of the best estimates I found was published back in 2011 by two researchers from UCLA. They estimated the size of the human body of knowledge by considering both analog and digital technologies that were in use between 1986 and 2007. They also did some clever mathematical tricks to try to account for redundant information. By their estimate, in 1986 there was approximately 2.6 exabytes of human knowledge. That's the number 26, followed by 17 zeros. That's a hard number to wrap your head around. Another way to think of it is how much physical space would all that data take if you stored it all on CD-ROMs stacked on top of one another. Now, most of you have probably never actually used a CD-ROM, so this analogy is a bit dated. However, they're thin, only 1.2 millimeters thick, less than 47/100ths of an inch. If you saved all of the information humans had generated by 1986 on CD-ROMs, you would have a stack that rose 3,032 miles above the Earth's surface. That's astounding. So, how high was that stack in 2007, the last year for which they collected data? 298,625 miles. To put that into some perspective, that's a stack that would reach from the surface of the Earth to the Moon and a quarter of the way back. That's mind-boggling. Not only does this give you some sense of just how effective science has been at generating new knowledge, it should also give you an idea of just how rapidly the body of human knowledge has grown. In just 21 years, from 1986 to 2007, the knowledge humans had generated grew by a factor of nearly 100. Just imagine how much larger it is now. This is a remarkable accomplishment, something we as a species ought to take some pride in. However, it also presents some real, practical problems. First, there is absolutely no way for anyone to keep up with all the new information that is being generated. Things are just changing too fast. Second, how in the world do you find and retrieve the information you need? These are practical questions you'll have to contend with as you work toward your capstone project this semester. However, these are also issues you'll be faced with repeatedly throughout your careers. Fortunately, we have some incredibly powerful tools that help us manage information overload and to help us find what we need. One of the most important of these is the humble abstract. Abstracts are just short summaries of anything, really. Most often, though, we think of abstracts as summaries of published journal articles. Now, abstract is kind of a funny name for a summary. When we usually think of the word abstract, we think of schools of art or things of the imagination, not things of the real world. However, there's an older meaning of abstract, and that is to distill something down to its essence. And that's exactly what an abstract of a journal article does. It gives you not just a short synopsis, but rather a summary of all the essential details. Just like the "You Are Here" mark on an information map at a shopping center orients shoppers to where they are in relation to the broader physical landscape, the background section of an abstract lets readers know where they are in relation to the intellectual landscape. Just after the background, or sometimes as part of it, abstracts will usually give some statement about what the authors tried to do in the study. We call this the objective, and it's always centered on some gap in human understanding that the authors were trying to fill in. Next, abstracts will have a list of methods the authors used to tackle the unknown they identified. This is always a brief description of what they did, just enough detail to help a competent reader understand the last two parts of the abstract, the results and conclusions. Sometimes results and conclusions may be combined. Even so, it's important to understand the distinction between the two. Results are just the facts uncovered by applying the methods to the problem highlighted in the objectives. Facts are just facts. You can't really argue against them. Your team either won or lost the game. The patient's symptoms either improved, stayed the same, or got worse. Rats with a particular genetic variation had a 20% higher chance of contracting a disease. These are all examples of results. Conclusions, by contrast, are the interpretations of those facts. The conclusion section tells the audience what the authors think those facts mean. In particular, they will explain whether the study successfully filled in the gap identified in the objectives or whether additional work needs to be done. That, in a nutshell, is a scientific abstract. I can imagine many of you scratching your heads wondering what the big deal is. To understand the genius of an abstract, consider what it does from the perspective of a scholar approaching the body of human knowledge, a huge, amorphous, and rapidly growing beast. As we'll discuss in upcoming videos, the primary way scholars engage with the body of scientific knowledge is through journal articles. However, journal articles are relatively long. They're also usually complicated. In other words, it takes a significant investment to read an entire journal article. It takes almost no time to read a short paragraph. And in that short paragraph that is an abstract, a reader gets a good summary of every part of the paper. This allows researchers to find what they're looking for much faster. It also allows researchers to keep up with the latest developments in their own field. A busy physician managing a practice hardly has hours each day to dedicate to reading. Almost everyone, though, can set aside 15 to 30 minutes to scan paragraph-length summaries of relevant research. Finally, abstracts are a great way to come up to speed when you're just stepping foot into a new field. That's something all of you will be doing for the capstone project of this course, the literature review. You may go into this project thinking the only way to be successful is if you read every article you come across from beginning to end. You may even believe that you have to understand every word. Nothing, however, could be further from the truth. Yes, at some point, to get a handle on your topic, you will have to delve deeply into the articles you're using. However, you don't need to do that right at the beginning. Indeed, it might not be helpful at that stage, causing more confusion than clarity. As you start to develop your research questions, then, just read abstracts. Set aside the most important articles to your project to be read in full later. So, yes, an abstract seems like a little thing, but it's a little thing with a big impact. As always, be gentle with yourselves, kind to one another. Thanks for watching.